please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, good to see you again. I enjoyed our conversation the other day, and congratulations on your nomination. Let me start with NATO, which is much the topic of conversation this morning. Of course, we may soon be asked to consider and vote on NATO expansion. You and I talked about this a little bit when we met. Let's start with the Wales Pledge. You're familiar, of course, with the Wales Pledge. You've talked about it, I know, today. Our current ambassador to NATO, Julie Smith, prior to her confirmation, sent me a letter in which she said, for the record, that it was her opinion that NATO allies should spend more than 2% of GDP on defense. In other words, to go beyond the Wales Pledge. The Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs said the same. Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Celeste Wallander, also said the same to me, that allies should go beyond the Wales Pledge. So let me just ask you, in your personal opinion now, is it time for NATO allies to move beyond the Wales Pledge and increase defense spending above 2%?
Senator, I really liked the ambassador's formulation on that. She has been saying 2% is a floor, not a ceiling, and I agree with that. I know all of the land forces chiefs in NATO. Each one of them has a list of requirements. The requirements are all would all take more than 2% of GDP. So I am an advocate of spending more than 2%, at least 2%. So great. I agree. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. When we talked last week, you told me that you didn't expect Finland's and Sweden's admission to NATO to result in U.S. force requirements in Europe. I've seen since then reports that Sweden is requesting a greater U.S. naval presence in the Baltic Sea. Also seeing reports the Pentagon plans to keep 100,000 plus troops in Europe for the foreseeable future. I just want to revisit this topic that you and I discussed in light of those reports. I mean, given this, how confident are you that Finland's and Sweden's accession to NATO would not result in U.S. forces doing more in Europe than we are currently obligated to under our current NATO commitments?
So the 100,000 forces in Europe that are being extended, that's part of the surge that we performed over the last few weeks, Senator, and was not related to the question of Finland and Sweden joining NATO. I remain of the opinion, as I told you in our office call, that at least in the ground domain, that this is not going to be a requirement for large additional forces or additional forces. I think exercises and occasional presence, like we do with any ally, will increase.
Different basing requirements, do you think? I mean, will there be? Will this necessitate a shift in posture by our forces or NATO forces?
I don't know right now, and I would point out that the word basing carries with it an enormous number of other implications that I would have to consider deeply before I came back to you with a firm response on basing.
Well, since you mentioned coming back, if you're confirmed, would you commit to providing the committee with a full account of the implications of Finland's and Sweden's potential accession to NATO force, to the implications for U.S. forces in Europe should they accede to NATO, so that we can consider that as part of any debate we might soon have in this chamber over NATO expansion?
Senator, I would be happy to do that if I'm confirmed.
Great, thank you. Still on this general topic, burden sharing. You and I talked about this with our NATO allies, and then vis-a-vis what we need to do in the Asia Pacific with regard to China. We're going to have to do a lot more burden sharing with our NATO allies, is my view, in Europe, if we're going to focus as we need to on PACOM. Let me just put it to you this way. Do you think our European allies should assume primary responsibility for conventional deterrence in Europe? With us, of course, the United States providing extended nuclear deterrence and more select conventional capabilities, but Europe really focusing on everything else as we shift scarce resources to China. What do you think about that?
Senator, I think it's imperative, as we look at the emergence of the threat of China, for us to find ways to be able to handle the acute threat of Russia in a collective fashion with the alliance that allows us to do that. There are a number of different ways that could play out. Almost all of those ways include increased burden sharing on the part of the alliance, on the part of other members of the alliance, I should say. But they also depend on what the security situation in Europe is like at the end of this conflict. So really, this conflict and the way it comes out is going to drive a lot of my answer to your question. It's just premature for me to talk about it.
Here's my last question. My time's expired, so I'll ask it and I'll let you answer and yield. What are some of the capabilities that we currently provide in Europe that you think European allies could feasibly contribute instead going forward?
Sir, some of the things we provide are heavy equipment and armor. Our allies could provide some of that. In many cases, it should be modernized first or in larger quantities. We provide long-range fires and logistics. We would encourage the development of those capabilities across the alliance, and then probably most importantly, increased air and missile defense across the alliance would be welcome contributions in terms of capability. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much, Senator Hawley. Senator King, please.
Thank you.
Senator Kelly, I'm sorry, excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to follow up on Senator Hawley's line of questioning here, General.